The pre-dawn light filtered the reinforced windows of the Joint Intelligence Command Center, casting long shadows across the polished concrete floor. Sarah Reynolds moved with the practiced economy of someone who had spent her entire life navigating military spaces, silent, purposeful, invisible. Her fingers curled around a steaming ceramic mug, the black coffee inside a near-perfect metaphor for her approach to intelligence work. Dark, strong, uncompromising. The briefing room hummed with a low-frequency tension that most would miss, a subtle vibration of potential energy, of secrets waiting to be unleashed. Around her, a constellation of intelligence specialists, tactical analysts, and senior officers formed their usual morning constellation. Major Rodriguez was hunched over a digital display, his fingers dancing across holographic projections that flickered with encrypted data. Lieutenant Chun stood rigid near the wall, her eyes scanning the room with the hypervigilance of someone who had seen too much and learned to trust nothing. Sarah knew this dance intimately. She had been born into it, raised in its rhythms, her childhood a masterclass in discretion and observation. Military bases had been her playgrounds, classified documents her bedtime stories. Where other children learned nursery rhymes, she had memorized NATO communication, protocols, and international border specifications. The patch on her arm was nothing special, at least to the untrained eye. A worn piece of fabric, slightly frayed at the edges, its colors muted by time and countless washings. It looked like something a nostalgic soldier might keep as a memento, a fragment of personal history sewn casually onto a uniform sleeve. But Colonel Marcus Garrett saw something else entirely. His gaze locked onto the patch with an intensity that momentarily transformed the bustling briefing room into a vacuum of suspended time. Years of covert operations had trained Garrett to notice the smallest details: a misplaced comma in a report, a microscopic variation in a satellite image, the barely perceptible tremor in a source's voice. And now, that razor-sharp perception was focused entirely on Sarah's arm. She was mid-sip when she felt the weight of his stare. Years of training prevented her from showing any outward reaction. Her posture remained relaxed, her grip on the coffee mug steady, her peripheral vision tracking the room's dynamics without betraying any internal tension. The coffee was from the new machine, a recent upgrade that promised barista-level quality, but delivered the same industrial-grade caffeine injection. Sarah appreciated its consistency. In her world, predictability was a form of security. Lieutenant Chun's voice cut through the background noise, discussing satellite reconnaissance data from a region of increasing geopolitical tension. Fragments of her briefing drifted across the room: unusual signal patterns, potential communication anomalies, unexplained infrastructure modifications. Just another Tuesday morning at the Intelligence Command Center, but something had changed. The air felt different, charged, as if an invisible circuit had been completed the moment Colonel Garrett's eyes found the patch. Sarah had worn the patch for years. It had traveled with her through multiple postings, survived countless security screenings, been subjected to routine equipment scans that should have flagged anything unusual. Yet here it was, seemingly innocent, a small piece of fabric that now appeared to hold an entire universe of unspoken implications. Colonel Garrett's hand, the same hand that had planned missions that would never appear in official records, that had signed orders capable of changing global narratives, moved almost imperceptibly. A slight adjustment of his stance, a nearly invisible lean forward. He knew something. The coffee continued to steam, a plume of warmth rising between Sarah and the Colonel. A barrier, a moment of normalcy in what was rapidly becoming anything but a normal briefing. "Reynolds," Garrett called, his voice a controlled instrument of professional authority. A moment. 2 words, simple, direct, but laden with an undercurrent that made every other conversation in the room fade into background static. Sarah met his gaze. Years of training had perfected her ability to reveal nothing, to become a mirror that reflected exactly what was expected. Yet beneath that calm exterior, something stirred, a genetic memory, perhaps. The inherited instinct of generations who understood that the most dangerous secrets are those hidden in plain sight. The patch on her arm seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a silent narrator waiting to begin its story. The memories came to Sarah like fragments of a half-forgotten dream, sharp-edged and luminous. Her grandmother Elena's hands had always been a map of resilience. Weathered like an old topographical chart, each line and crease told a story of survival. Sarah remembered those hands pressing the patch into her palm on her 10th birthday, in a moment that felt both intimate and ceremonial. Some secrets, Elena had whispered, her accent a melodic blend of languages that spoke of borders, crossed and identities navigated, are louder than words. They pulse, they breathe, they remember. The Reynolds family was not a typical military lineage. They were architects of unseen narratives, specialists in the art of information, those who understood that true power resided not in weapons, but in understanding. Her father, Michael Reynolds, had been a strategic intelligence analyst with a reputation for seeing patterns where others saw only chaos. His office had been a sacred space of controlled disorder maps covered in translucent overlays, encrypted communications dancing across multiple screens, mathematical models that predicted human behavior with surgical precision. Intelligence is not about knowing everything, he would tell young Sarah, spreading out complex geographical projections across their kitchen table. It's about understanding the spaces between what is known and what is possible. Her mother, Dr. Catherine Reynolds, was a cryptographer whose work bridged multiple disciplines. Mathematics, linguistics, quantum computing. She moved between these worlds with the same ease that other people changed clothes. To Catherine, every communication was a puzzle, every message a potential key to understanding deeper human connections. Sarah's childhood was a masterclass in observation. While other children played with dolls or video games, she was decoding complex communication patterns, learning multiple languages before she could fully write in her native English. Family dinners were never simple meals, they were strategic discussions, intellectual sparring matches, where information was the primary currency. The patch was always present, though its significance was never explicitly explained. It hung in Elena's study, framed like a piece of abstract art. Sometimes Sarah would catch her grandmother staring at it, her eyes focused on some distant horizon that existed only in memory. Not all battles are fought with weapons, Elena would say, running her fingers along the patch's intricate weave. Some wars are won in silence, through understanding. Elena's own history was a whispered legend within the family. Born in a small village on the border of two countries that no longer existed, she had been more than a resistance fighter. She was a communication architect, building networks of information exchange. When traditional channels were systematically destroyed, during a conflict that most history books had sanitized into sterile paragraphs, Elena had created communication, routes that saved thousands of lives. Not through armed resistance, but through an intricate web of information exchange that rendered traditional military strategies obsolete. The patch was her masterpiece, technological and human marvel that defied conventional understanding. More than a piece of fabric, it was a living document of human resilience, of the power of connection in the face of systematic disconnection. Sarah's training had been both deliberate and organic. Her parents never commanded her learning. They invited her into their world of strategic thinking. Mathematical models became bedtime stories. Geopolitical analyses were dinner conversations. Complex communication theories were her playground. By the time she entered military intelligence, Sarah was not just prepared, she was inevitable. a product of generations of strategic thinkers, of those who understood that the most profound revolutions happen not on battlefields, but in the intricate networks of human communication. The patch was her inheritance. Not just a physical object, but a philosophy, a way of seeing the world that transcended traditional boundaries of nation, conflict, and understanding. Colonel Garrett's recognition in that morning briefing was more than a moment of professional curiosity. It was the first tremor of a story that had been waiting decades to be told, a narrative that connected a grandmother's resistance, a family's unique approach to intelligence, and a world on the brink of a communication revolution. The patch was never just a piece of fabric in the sterile confines of the Advanced Materials Laboratory. Dr. Elena Reyes, the foremost expert in quantum textile engineering, examined the artifact with a reverence typically reserved for archaeological discoveries. Her gloved hands moved with microscopic precision, each movement calculated to reveal the patch's most intimate secrets. Quantum encrypted, microfibers danced beneath the high-resolution quantum microscope, revealing a complexity that defied conventional understanding of communication technology. What appeared to be a simple woven patch was, in reality, a communication network compressed into a space smaller than a human palm. The technology predated modern digital communication by decades. Its origin traced back to a period of global conflict where traditional communication channels were systematically compromised. Elena's grandmother, Sarah's grandmother, had been more than a resistance fighter. She was a technological visionary who understood that information was the most powerful weapon. The patch's core was a marvel of analog quantum hybridization. Traditional textile weaving techniques were merged with cutting-edge quantum communication principles. Each thread was more than a simple strand of fabric. It was a potential communication channel, a data point, a fragment of a larger intelligence. Network. Dr. Reyes's computer screens flickered with complex algorithmic translations. The patch's communication matrix was a living, breathing system. It didn't transmit data in the traditional sense. It resonated. Like a complex neural network, it could adapt, shift, and communicate through quantum entanglement principles that most modern scientists considered theoretical at best. Sarah watched the analysis, her professional demeanor masking a deep personal connection. This wasn't just a piece of family history. It was a technological artifact that could rewrite understanding of communication technologies. Your grandmother, Dr. Reyes said, her voice a mixture of professional excitement and historical reverence, was generations ahead of her time. The patch's origin story was a tapestry of innovation, born from necessity. During a conflict that had systematically destroyed traditional communication infrastructures, Elena Reynolds had created something extraordinary. It was a communication system that could transmit information through quantum resonance, bypassing conventional electronic surveillance. Imagine a communication method that didn't rely on electromagnetic waves or digital signals. Instead, it used the fundamental quantum properties of matter itself. Each thread could carry multiple layers of encrypted information, adaptable and nearly undetectable by traditional scanning technologies. The military intelligence community had spent decades trying to understand similar technologies. Billions of dollars had been invested in quantum communication research, and here was a prototype that had existed decades before such research became a priority. Sarah's fingers traced the patch's edge, feeling the intricate weave that seemed to pulse with an almost living energy. Her grandmother hadn't just created a communication tool. She had designed a philosophical statement about human connection. Dr. Reyes continued her analysis, each revelation more extraordinary than the last. The patch contained multiple layers of communication protocols. It could adapt its transmission frequency, change its quantum signature, and even reconstruct partial information if sections were damaged. It's not just a communication device, Dr. Reyes explained, her excitement barely contained. It's a complete communication ecosystem. Adaptive, resilient, almost alive. The technological implications were staggering. Modern communication. Systems relied on fixed infrastructure satellites, cellular networks, fiber optic cables. This patch operated on an entirely different principle. It could transmit information through quantum entanglement, creating communication channels that were virtually undetectable and impossible to intercept. But the patch was more than a technological marvel. It was a testament to human innovation born from extreme circumstances. Created during a period of global conflict, it represented the ultimate expression of human resilience, the ability to communicate, to connect, when all traditional systems failed. Sarah understood now why Colonel Garrett had looked at her with such intensity during the morning briefing. This wasn't just a piece of family history. It was a technological artifact that could potentially revolutionize global communication strategies. The quantum microscope continued its relentless examination, each magnification revealing new layers of complexity, threads that were simultaneously data carriers, encryption mechanisms, and adaptive communication nodes, a technology that was part communication device, part historical artifact, and part philosophical statement about human connection. The Joint Intelligence Command Center, transformed at night, a living organism of technological surveillance and strategic calculation. Banks of monitors glowed with a constellation of global data points, each screen a window into a potential conflict zone, a brewing diplomatic crisis, a whisper of impending global shift. Sarah Reynolds moved through this electronic ecosystem with the precision of a neural network, her fingers dancing across multiple interfaces. To the untrained eye, she was just another intelligence specialist. But those who understood the intricate dance of global information knew she was something more, a maestro of strategic intelligence. Her current assignment was anything but straightforward. A series of communication blackouts had emerged in a region traditionally known for its complex geopolitical landscape. Traditional monitoring systems had gone dark, satellite communications jammed, ground-based communication towers mysteriously offline. Most intelligence teams would approach this as a standard communication disruption. Sarah saw something else entirely. The patch, her inherited technological marvel, seemed to pulse with an almost sentient awareness. During her analysis, she noticed subtle patterns in the communication disruptions. They weren't random. They were deliberate, choreographed. Each blackout was like a carefully placed punctuation mark in a larger, more complex sentence. Major Rodriguez approached, his digital tablet displaying a series of fragmented communication logs. "We're missing something," he muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. "These blackouts, they're too precise, too calculated." Precision was a Reynolds family trademark. Sarah's mind was already reconstructing the communication landscape, looking for the spaces between the data points. Where others saw empty spaces, she saw potential communication channels. Her workstation was a controlled chaos of multiple monitors, each displaying different layers of global communication infrastructures. Encrypted military channels, civilian communication networks, underwater cable system maps, satellite communication grids. Sarah could read these like most people read a morning newspaper. The patch seemed to respond to her concentration. Microscopic quantum threads within its weave began to resonate, capturing communication frequencies that modern scanning technologies would miss entirely. "I need access to the historical communication archives," Sarah told the system's AI interface. Her request wasn't a question. It was a surgical instruction. Years of training had taught her that intelligence work was never about having all the answers. It was about asking the right questions, about seeing the connections that others missed. Family's approach to intelligence was fundamentally different from traditional military thinking. Where others saw conflict as a series of confrontations, the Reynolds understood conflict as a complex communication problem. Every military engagement, every diplomatic tension, was ultimately a failure of communication. The patch was more than a technological artifact. It was a philosophy, a way of understanding global dynamics that transcended traditional intelligence methodologies. Major Rodriguez watched her work, a mixture of professional respect and barely concealed curiosity. Sarah's reputation within the intelligence community was unique. She didn't just analyze data, she conversed with it. Her reports weren't just intelligence briefings. They were intricate narratives that revealed the human stories behind global tensions. As the night progressed, a pattern began to emerge. The communication blackouts weren't random disruptions. They were a language, a complex, multi-layered communication system that was using the absence of information as its primary method of transmission. The quantum threads in the patch began to vibrate at a frequency that most modern scanning equipment would completely miss. Sarah realized she was witnessing something extraordinary, a communication method that existed in the negative spaces of traditional information systems. "It's not about what's being said," she muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. "It's about what's not being said." Her workstation began to generate a three-dimensional holographic representation of the communication landscape. Gaps in the communication networks weren't empty spaces, they were deliberate communication channels. Each blackout was a carefully placed note in a larger, more complex symphony of global information. The patch on her arm seemed to grow warmer, its quantum threads resonating with the emerging communication pattern. Something was coming. Something that would challenge everything the intelligence community understood about global communication, conflict, and information exchange. The private briefing room was a study in controlled tension. Walls lined with sound-dampening technology, reinforced glass that could withstand both physical and electronic intrusion, and an atmosphere that felt charged with unspoken histories. Colonel Marcus Garrett sat across from Sarah, his posture a perfect blend of military discipline and something else, anticipation perhaps, or recognition. "Your grandmother," he began, his voice low and measured, "was not just a resistance fighter. She was the architect of a communication network that rewrote the rules of global intelligence." The statement hung in the air, heavy with implications. Sarah remained perfectly still, decades of training preventing any involuntary reaction. But internally, her mind was a storm of calculations, piecing together fragments of family history that had always existed just beyond her full understanding. Garrett pushed a series of classified documents across the table. They were old, yellowed. At the edges, some pages so delicate they seemed ready to disintegrate at a touch. But the information they contained was anything but fragile. Detailed maps showed communication networks that predated modern satellite technology. Intricate diagrams revealed a communication system so advanced it made current quantum communication research look like children's play. And at the center of each document, subtle references to Elena Reynolds. "During the Cold War," Garrett continued, "your grandmother developed a communication network that could transmit information through what we now understand as quantum entanglement. But back then, it was something far more revolutionary." The patch on Sarah's arm seemed to vibrate with a subtle energy, as if responding to the conversation. She could feel its quantum threads resonating, confirming something that words could not fully express. Garrett's fingers traced a complex diagram. Traditional communication channels could be intercepted, destroyed, compromised. But Elena created something different. A communication system that existed in the spaces between information undetectable, uninterruptible, adaptive. Sarah remembered her grandmother's words. Some secrets are louder than words. They pulse, they breathe, they remember. Now she understood. The documents revealed a network that was more than a communication system. It was a living, breathing intelligence network that could reconstruct itself, adapt to changing environments, and transmit critical information when all other channels failed. During conflicts where entire communication infrastructures were systematically destroyed, Garrett explained, Elena's network became a lifeline, not just for military operations, but for humanitarian efforts, for preserving human connections. When everything else was being torn apart, the revelation was staggering. What had seemed like family stories, cryptic conversations, and mysterious patches were now revealed as a technological marvel that had potentially changed the course of global conflicts. "The patch you wear," Garrett said, his eyes locked on the fabric, "is more than a memorial. It's an active communication node, the last remaining prototype of a system your grandmother developed." Sarah's mind raced. The quantum encrypted microfibers. The adaptive communication principles she had studied, they all traced back to this moment, to her grandmother's extraordinary vision. "We've been trying to understand its full capabilities for decades," Garrett continued. "Every time we think we've decoded its potential, it reveals another layer of complexity." The implications were profound. This wasn't just a technological artifact. It was a philosophical statement about human communication, about resilience, about finding connection in the most challenging circumstances. "There's an active mission," Garrett said, his tone shifting. "A humanitarian crisis in a region where traditional communication has been completely compromised. And this," he pointed to the patch, "might be our only way through." Sarah understood then that this was more than a professional assignment. This was a legacy being called forward, a mission that connected her directly to her grandmother's work, to a tradition of finding human connection in the most challenging circumstances. The patch on her arm pulsed not with light, but with a quantum resonance that spoke of untold stories, of networks waiting to be activated, of a communication philosophy that transcended traditional understanding. Something was coming. A mission that would challenge everything about modern intelligence. Work. A moment where her grandmother's legacy would be fully realized. The situation was critical. Deep in the fractured landscape of the Karakoram, borderlands, a region where political boundaries dissolved like mirages, and communication was a matter of survival. A humanitarian crisis was unfolding. 63. Medical researchers and aid workers were trapped in a research station, cut off from the world by a complex web of geopolitical tensions and technological jamming. Standard communication protocols had failed weeks ago. Satellite networks were rendered useless, cellular towers reduced to silent sentinels. Traditional rescue missions would be suicide. The region was a labyrinth of competing military interests, where a single misstep could trigger an international incident. Sarah stood in the Advanced Operations Center, the patch on her arm now more than a piece of fabric. It was a living communication matrix, vibrating with a quantum resonance that defied conventional understanding. "We have a 36-hour window," Colonel Garrett briefed, his fingers moving across a holographic display that showed the terrain in three-dimensional relief. "After that, the political landscape becomes completely unstable." The mission was a delicate dance of technological innovation and human resilience. Sarah's grandmother's communication network would be their only lifeline. The patch began to transform. What appeared to be a simple piece of fabric started to unfold its technological complexity. Microscopic quantum threads activated, creating a communication matrix that could penetrate the most sophisticated jamming technologies. Dr. Elena Reyes, the quantum textile engineer who had studied the patch, explained the technology with a mixture of scientific precision and barely contained excitement. "It doesn't just transmit information," she said, pointing to the evolving communication patterns. "It creates communication channels where none exist." The borderland region was a technological dead zone, a place where traditional communication infrastructures collapsed under the weight of geopolitical complexity. Mountains that had witnessed centuries of conflict now became the stage for a rescue mission that defied conventional military strategy. Sarah's preparation was more than tactical training. It was a lifetime of inherited knowledge. Her fingers moved across communication interfaces with an intuition that seemed to transcend standard operational protocols. She wasn't just reading data, she was conversing with it. The patch's quantum communication network began to map the terrain, not through traditional satellite imaging, but through a more fundamental method of information exchange. It was reading the landscape's quantum signatures, creating a communication topology that was invisible to conventional scanning technologies. "We're not just sending a rescue team," Sarah explained to the assembled intelligence specialists. "We're creating a living communication network that can adapt to the terrain's challenges." Each member of the rescue team was equipped with a modified communication device inspired by the patch's quantum communication principles. They weren't just carrying communication tools. They were nodes in a living, breathing information network. The mission's complexity went beyond traditional rescue operations. They were entering a region where information was more valuable than weapons, where the ability to communicate could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. Military strategists had spent decades trying to develop communication technologies that could operate in extreme environments. Sarah's grandmother had done it decades ago, using principles that modern scientists were only beginning to understand. As the rescue team prepared, Sarah felt the patch's quantum threads synchronizing with her own biological rhythms. It was more than a technological device. It was a living communication organism that understood the fundamental principles of human connection. The first phase of the mission began with something unexpected. Instead of a traditional insertion point, the team would use the patch's quantum communication network to create temporary communication corridors, invisible pathways that could guide them through the treacherous terrain. "We're not just rescuing researchers," Colonel Garrett said, his voice a mixture of professional calm and underlying tension. "We're proving that human connection can transcend technological and political barriers." The quantum communication network began to pulse, a living, breathing system that was simultaneously a communication device, a navigation tool, and a lifeline. 63 lives hung in the balance. A humanitarian mission that would test the limits of technological innovation, human resilience, and the fundamental principles of communication. The patch on Sarah's arm was no longer just a piece of fabric. It was a testament to her grandmother's vision, a living proof that true communication was about more than technology. It was about understanding, about connection, about finding a way when no way seemed possible. The aftermath was unlike anything the intelligence community had ever witnessed. 63 lives saved, an impossible mission completed, and a technological breakthrough that would redefine global communication strategies. The debriefing room was a cathedral of controlled chaos. Senior intelligence officials, quantum communication experts, and military strategists moved like electrons, charged, unpredictable, revolutionary. Sarah stood at the center of the storm, a patch on her arm now a subject of intense scientific scrutiny. What had begun as a family heirloom had become the most significant communication technology discovery of the century. Dr. Elena Reyes presented her initial findings, her voice a mixture of scientific precision and barely contained excitement. "This isn't just a communication device," she explained. "Holographic displays, dancing with quantum communication patterns. It's a living communication ecosystem." The rescue mission had been more than a humanitarian effort. It was a proof of concept that challenged everything the intelligence community understood about information exchange. The researchers they had rescued brought with them data that would take years to fully comprehend. Field notes describing communication methods that seemed to defy the fundamental laws of information transfer. Observations of how the quantum communication network had adapted to the most challenging terrain imaginable. Colonel Garrett watched, Sarah with a mixture of professional assessment and something deeper, a recognition of a legacy continuing. "Your grandmother?" he said quietly during a brief moment between briefings. She saw the future when the rest of the world was still trapped in the present. The transformation extended beyond the technological breakthrough. The geopolitical landscape had shifted in ways that would take months, perhaps years, to fully understand. The rescue mission had created communication corridors that challenged existing political boundaries. Those 63 researchers were more than survivors. They were witnesses to a communication revolution, not each team member who had been equipped with the quantum communication devices reported extraordinary experiences. Communication that happened not through traditional signals, but through quantum resonance. Information exchanges that seemed to transcend physical limitations. Sarah found herself at the center of a profound transformation. The patch her grandmother's legacy was now the most sought-after technological artifact in global intelligence circles. But it wasn't just about the technology. It was about a fundamental reimagining of human connection. Intelligence agencies from multiple countries began reaching out, not with demands, but with a genuine desire to understand. The rescue mission had demonstrated something profound, that true communication was about more than technological infrastructure. It was about understanding, about finding connections in the most challenging circumstances. The scientific community was equally electrified. Quantum communication experts, who had spent decades working on theoretical models, now had a living, functioning prototype. The patch represented a quantum leap in communication technology, quite literally. Dr. Marcus Chun, a leading quantum communication researcher, described it as finding a working quantum computer in an antique shop. Except this is infinitely more complex. Sarah's personal transformation was equally profound. She was no longer just an intelligence specialist. She had become the custodian of a technological legacy that could reshape global communication. Her family's approach to intelligence, seeing communication as a living, adaptive system, had been validated in the most dramatic way possible. Patch continued to surprise researchers. It wasn't just a static communication device. It adapted, learned, evolved. Each analysis revealed new layers of complexity. Quantum threads that could reconstruct communication pathways, create temporary information networks, and operate in environments that would destroy conventional communication technologies. "We're looking at a communication technology," one researcher noted during a classified briefing, "that doesn't just transmit information, it understands it." For Sarah, it was more than a professional breakthrough. It was a deeply personal connection to her grandmother's vision. Elena Reynolds had understood something fundamental about human communication that most experts were only beginning to comprehend. The world of intelligence, of global communication, had changed. And at the center of that change was a patch, a legacy, and a fundamental reimagining of how humans connect. Colonel Garrett approached Sarah during a quiet moment, his typically controlled demeanor showing a hint of genuine emotion. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said simply. The patch on Sarah's arm seemed to pulse a quiet acknowledgement of a legacy continuing, of a vision being realized. The world looked different, now. 6 months after the mission, Sarah Reynolds stood at the window of a research facility that didn't officially exist, watching the sunrise paint the horizon with possibilities. The patch, her grandmother's legacy, was no longer just a family secret. It had become a beacon of hope, a testament to human innovation that transcended traditional boundaries of communication, conflict, and understanding. Her office was a deliberate contradiction. Cutting-edge quantum communication interfaces shared space with old photographs, family mementos, and the original documents that told the story of Elena Reynolds' extraordinary vision. Each artifact was a chapter in a larger narrative of human resilience. The global impact was profound and far-reaching. The communication technology derived from the patch had already begun to reshape humanitarian efforts. Remote medical teams could now communicate in environments previously considered communication dead zones. Disaster response capabilities had been revolutionized. Communities separated by geographical or political barriers found new ways to connect. But Sarah understood that the true revolution was not technological. It was philosophical. Her grandmother's approach to communication had always been about more than transmitting information. It was about understanding, about finding connection in the most challenging circumstances. Colonel Garrett approached, his steps measured, carrying a folder that spoke of new possibilities. The United Nations Communication Restructuring Committee wants to meet with you, he said, a rare smile breaking through his typically stoic demeanor. They're calling it the most significant communication breakthrough of the century. The patch on Sarah's arm seemed to resonate. A quantum thread of memory connecting past and present. International research teams had been working tirelessly to understand the full potential of the communication technology. What had begun as a family secret was now a global collaborative effort. Scientists from different disciplines, quantum physicists, communication theorists, humanitarian experts were building upon Elena Reynolds's foundational work. Sarah's role had transformed. She was no longer just an intelligence specialist. She had become a bridge between technological innovation and human understanding, between her grandmother's legacy and the world's future potential. The most recent research suggested that the communication technology was more than a static system. It was adaptive, learning, evolving. Each analysis revealed new layers of complexity. Quantum threads that could reconstruct communication pathways, create temporary information networks, and operate in environments that would destroy conventional communication technologies. We're not just talking about a communication device. Dr. Elena Reyes had explained during a recent global conference. We're discussing a new understanding of how information lives, moves, and connects. The geopolitical implications were equally profound. The technology challenged traditional concepts of borders, of communication infrastructure, of how human beings understand connection. Sarah found herself reflecting on her grandmother's words. Some secrets are louder than words. They pulse. They breathe. They remember. Now she understood the full depth of that statement. A new generation of communication specialists was emerging. Young researchers who saw information not as a static commodity, but as a living, breathing entity. The patch had become more than a technological artifact. It was a philosophy, a way of understanding human connection. The research facility around her was a testament to possibility. Teams from different disciplines, different countries, working together to understand a technology that defied conventional understanding. Quantum communication experts, humanitarian specialists, communication theorists, all united by a shared vision. Colonel Garrett approached again, this time with a more personal demeanor. Your grandmother would be proud, he said, a statement. That was both professional assessment and personal acknowledgement. Sarah understood that the mission was far from over. This was just the beginning. The patch continued to surprise researchers. It wasn't just a communication device. It was a living record of human potential, of the ability to find connection when all other systems failed. As the sun continued to rise, casting long shadows across the research facility, Sarah Reynolds understood her true inheritance. It wasn't just a technological breakthrough. It was a philosophy of human connection, a way of seeing the world that transcended traditional boundaries. Some legacies are passed down through blood, some through technology, some through an understanding that goes beyond words. Hers was all of these and something more.